She was just a janitor mopping floors at midnight until the night she found Caroline Levitt's secret notebook. Now, the entire White House is looking for her. What could possibly be inside those pages that's worth risking everything? The biang. Fluorescent lights of the Capitol building hummed ominously, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors as Rosa Mendez pushed her heavy mop bucket down the deserted hallway. The clock had long since struck midnight, and the usually bustling government building stood eerily silent, its grandeur feeling almost mocking as she worked her third consecutive shift that week. Her lower back screamed in protest with every movement, a dull ache that had become as constant as her exhaustion, while her hands, red and cracked from hours of exposure to harsh cleaning chemicals, gripped the mop handle with practiced determination. The soles of her worn-out sneakers, their once white fabric now permanently stained gray from years of service, offered no cushion against the unforgiving hard floors that left her feet throbbing with every step. But physical pain was the least of her concerns when she thought about Mateo, her bright-eyed 12-year-old waiting at home in their cramped one-bedroom apartment. His latest report card, carefully pinned to their refrigerator with a magnet, from the local grocery store, flashed in her mind. Straight A's in every subject, just like always. "Mama, my teacher says I could get a full scholarship to that science academy if I keep this up," he'd told her just that morning, his voice brimming with a hope that both warmed her heart and filled her with quiet terror. Because while scholarships might cover tuition, they didn't pay the skyrocketing rent for their apartment in a neighborhood that grew more expensive by the month. They didn't put food on the table when her paycheck barely stretched far enough. And they certainly didn't cover the cost of Mateo's asthma medication, the life-saving inhalers that kept him breathing through the polluted city air. So Rosa worked. And worked. And when one job wasn't enough, she took on another, her body protesting, but her spirit refusing to surrender to exhaustion. The sudden sound of hurried footsteps echoing through the cavernous hallway snapped her from her thoughts. Instinctively, she straightened up, one hand going to the small of her back as she turned toward the noise. What she saw made her breath catch. Caroline Levitt, the White House's famously unflappable spokesperson, usually the picture of polished composure in her tailored suits and perfect blonde updos, was practically running down the corridor, her usually immaculate appearance in disarray. Strands of hair had escaped her tight bun, sticking to her flushed cheeks, while her designer blazer hung crookedly over one shoulder, as if she'd thrown it on in a hurry. But it was the expression on Levitt's face that truly unsettled Rosa, a wild, haunted look in her eyes that spoke of something far beyond the usual political crises. Before Rosa could call out or even process what she was seeing, Levitt disappeared into an unmarked office, the door clicking shut behind her, but not quite latching. And there, lying innocently on the plush government-issue carpet just outside the doorway, was a small, leather-bound notebook that must have slipped from Levitt's bag in her haste. Rosa froze, her cleaning cart creaking as she unconsciously tightened her grip on its handle. Every instinct honed from years of working in these hallowed halls of power screamed at her to keep moving, to pretend she hadn't seen anything. She knew better than most how dangerous it was to touch anything in these corridors, how quickly a lowly janitor could find herself accused of theft, of spying, of any number of crimes that would cost her not just this job but any chance of future employment. One wrong move, one moment of curiosity, and she could lose everything. The fragile stability she'd built for Mateo, the roof over their heads, the medical care he depended on. But something about the way Levitt had looked, the sheer, uncharacteristic panic in her normally steely gaze, rooted Rosa to the spot. And then there was the notebook itself, its spine cracked open just enough to reveal a single line of handwriting so forceful it had nearly torn through the page. "If they find out about the children, it's over." The words hit Rosa like a physical blow, her breath coming short and sharp. Children? What children? Her mind immediately flew to Mateo, to the countless nights she'd lain awake worrying about immigration raids, about the fragile protections that kept them safe. about the ever-present fear that one day she might not come home from work. Her fingers, calloused from years of labor, trembled as she reached for the notebook before she could stop herself. This was madness. She knew it. Was madness. But what if this wasn't just political intrigue? What if this was about something real, something that affected families like hers? The notebook felt heavier than it should have as she flipped it open, the worn leather cool against her skin. The second page nearly stopped her heart. Names. Dozens of them, written in neat columns that somehow made the contents even more horrifying. In their organization, Maria Gutierrez, Javier Hernandez, Lila Morales. Each name followed by a location, some she recognized as government facilities, others completely unfamiliar, and a date spanning the last 6 months. But it was the final notation after each entry that turned her blood to ice. Relocated. The world seemed to tilt around her, the polished floors and high ceilings of the Capitol suddenly feeling like a gilded cage. This wasn't just a notebook. It was a ledger. A record. And if the dates were correct, these weren't just any children. They were the sons and daughters of undocumented immigrants, kids who had quietly vanished from shelters and schools across the country, their disappearances either ignored or explained away by officials. Kids the evening news occasionally mentioned in brief, somber segments, before moving on to more pressing political dramas. Kids no one with power seemed to be looking for. A door slammed somewhere down the hall, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the empty building. Rosa barely had time to shove the notebook into the deep pocket of her janitorial apron before 2. Security guards rounded the corner, their radios crackling with urgent static. All personnel, report any suspicious activity on the 3rd floor immediately. Possible security breach. Rosa's entire body went cold with realization. They weren't just looking for the notebook. They were looking for her. The next morning, dawn, crept through the thin curtains of Rosa's apartment with cruel indifference to the sleepless night she'd endured. She stood motionless in her tiny kitchen, the notebook now hidden beneath a stack of Mateo's meticulously completed homework assignments, her hands braced against the chipped formica countertop as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. She hadn't slept. Hadn't even tried. All night, she'd paced the narrow confines of their apartment, careful not to wake Mateo as she moved from living room to kitchen and back again, her mind racing through the implications of what she'd read. The words from the notebook played on a relentless loop in her mind. Operation Safe Haven. Terminate all evidence if exposed. What kind of operation gave itself such a benevolent name while secretly cataloging missing children? The creak of Mateo's bedroom door snapped her from her spiraling thoughts. Her son shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes with one small fist, his dark curls sticking up in every direction. He took one look at her, still wearing yesterday's uniform, and frowned, his sharp young mind immediately picking up on the wrongness of the situation. "Mama, why are you still in your work clothes?" he asked, his voice still thick with sleep but already tinged with concern. "Did you just get home?" Rosa forced her lips into what she hoped was a convincing smile, reaching out to smooth his wild hair. "Just thinking, mijo," she lied, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. But her mind was racing far beyond the confines of their tiny kitchen. She couldn't go back to work. Not now. Not after what she'd taken. Not after what she knew. But if she ran, how would she protect Mateo? Where would they go? Her entire life was here. Her job, their home, Mateo's school. And yet, if she stayed silent, if she did nothing with the knowledge now burning a hole in her conscience, what would happen to those other children, to their families? The faces of the missing children from the notebook swam before her eyes. How? Many of them had mothers just like her, lying awake at night wondering where their babies were. Her phone buzzed violently against the countertop, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense quiet of the kitchen. An unknown number flashed on the screen. The message was brief and to the point. We know you have it. Meet me, alone. 5th Street Church, midnight. Rosa's hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the phone. It had to be from Levitt. But was this a trap? A way to retrieve the evidence and silence her permanently? Or was it, and this possibility terrified her almost as much, a genuine plea for help from someone who'd reached the limits of what they could do alone? She looked at Mateo, now pouring cereal into a bowl with the intense concentration he brought to every task, his innocent face already showing hints of the man he would become. She thought of the names in that notebook: Maria, Javier, Lila. Kids, with dreams just like his, with families who loved them just as fiercely. Rosa made her choice. The abandoned church on 5th Street loomed before her like something from a nightmare, its once grand facade now crumbling at the edges, the stained glass windows long since broken and replaced with plywood. Rosa stood across the street, hidden in the shadows of a boarded-up storefront, watching for any sign of movement. The neighborhood had been hit hard by the economic downturn, whole blocks standing empty as businesses folded and families moved away. It was the perfect place for a meeting no one was supposed to know about. Taking a deep breath, that did nothing. To calm her racing heart, Rosa crossed the empty street, her sneakers making no sound on the cracked pavement. The heavy wooden door of the church groaned in protest as she pushed it open, the scent of mildew and old incense immediately assaulting her senses. Inside, the pews stood like silent sentinels in the moonlight filtering through the few remaining. Intact windows, the air thick with dust that swirled in the pale beams of light. She clutched the notebook to her chest like a shield, her heart pounding so violently she was certain it could be heard throughout the empty building. "You came." The voice came from the shadows near the altar, and Rosa nearly jumped out of her skin as Caroline Levitt stepped into a patch of moonlight, her usual polished appearance replaced by something raw and unfiltered. Dark circles ringed her red-rimmed eyes, and her normally perfect blonde hair hung in loose, greasy strands around her face. She wore jeans and a hoodie, clothing so unlike her usual power suits that it somehow made her seem like a different person entirely. "I didn't think you would," Levitt admitted, her voice hoarse as if she'd been crying. "After everything. I wouldn't have blamed you if you'd burned it." Rosa found her voice, though it came out sharper than she intended. "Who are those children?" Levitt's gaze dropped to the floor, her shoulders slumping under some invisible weight. "The ones they don't want you to know about," she whispered, the words barely audible in the vast emptiness of the church. She took a step closer, and Rosa instinctively tightened her grip on the notebook. "Rosa, you have to understand. This wasn't my idea. When I first started at Justice, I believed in what we were doing, but then I began noticing discrepancies. Children who came into custody but never appeared in the official numbers. Facilities that didn't exist on any map." Her voice cracked. "So I started documenting it. Names, locations, proof." "Proof of what?" Rosa demanded, her fear giving way to a rising anger that burned in her chest. "That they're being hidden," Levitt whispered, the words seeming to cost her something vital. "Not deported, not sent back to their families, hidden. Because if the public ever found out the government was keeping children in unregistered detention centers, stripping them of their identities, moving them around like chess pieces." She trailed off, the implication hanging heavy in the air between them. Rosa's stomach twisted violently, bile rising in her throat. She thought of Mateo, of how easily he could have been one of those names in the ledger. "Why tell me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You could have gone to the press. You have connections, power." Levitt's laugh was bitter and hollow. "You think I haven't tried? Every reporter I trusted turned out to be on someone's payroll. Every official I reached out to either didn't believe me or was part of it." She met Rosa's eyes squarely for the first time. "But you're the one person they'd never suspect. You're invisible to them. A janitor. A nobody." She said it without malice, just a cold statement of fact. If you take this to the right people, real journalists, activists, anyone outside the system, you could blow this wide open. Rosa thought of Matteo asleep in his bed, trusting that his mother would keep him safe. She thought of the families, of those missing children, their grief and fear a mirror of what she would feel if Matteo were taken from her. "What happens to me after?" she asked quietly, already knowing the answer. Levitt's jaw tightened, her eyes glistening in the dim light. "I can't protect you," she admitted. "Once this gets out, they'll come for both of us. But those children, their families." Silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of the unspoken. Then Rosa nodded once, sharply. "Tell me where to start." 3 days later, the story detonated across the national consciousness like a bomb. Front-page headlines screamed from every newspaper in the country. Secret government program holding immigrant children in unregistered facilities. News vans clogged the streets outside the Capitol, their satellite dishes pointing skyward like accusing fingers. Protests erupted in every major city, crowds chanting and holding signs with the names from Levitt's notebook painted in bold letters. The contents of the notebook, every name, every location, every damning detail, had been meticulously copied and distributed to investigative journalists, civil rights organizations, and most crucially, the desperate families of the missing children. Rosa watched it all unfold from a safe house provided by an immigrant rights organization. Matteo curled protectively against her side as they stared at the television screen. The news showed footage of a warehouse in Texas being stormed by authorities, the camera shaking as dozens of children, some as young as 5 or 6, were led blinking into the sunlight. "Mama," Matteo whispered, his small hand gripping hers tightly. "Are we in trouble?" She kissed the top of his head, breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo. "No, mijo," she murmured against his hair. "We're free." Across the country, similar. Scenes played out as facility after facility was raided, children being reunited with weeping parents. Government officials resigned in disgrace. Congressional hearings were announced. And Caroline Levitt? She stood at a press conference, her voice steady but her hands visibly shaking as she announced her resignation from the Justice Department and her commitment to testifying before Congress about what she knew. But as Rosa scrolled through news updates on her phone, one question gnawed at her with relentless persistence: how many other notebooks were still out there? How many more children were waiting to be found? What would you have done if you'd found that notebook? Would you have risked everything to expose the truth, or protected your own family at all costs? Comment below with your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories where ordinary people face impossible choices, because sometimes the quietest voices are the ones that change the world.